What advice would you have for a young person who's currently in medical school, feeling some of that frustration and helplessness, overwhelmed by the burden of responsibility, challenged by the hierarchy? What would you say to somebody like that today?
It's something I didn't enjoy hearing and I didn't find particularly instructive in the moment when I heard it. But in hindsight, it was helpful to note that you're not the only one. Unfortunately, you're not the only one. It
Yeah.
would probably be a good thing if only one or if a handful of people were frustrated. I think I've also had the benefit and the immense privilege of having seen much early in my medical path the different parts that exist beyond being a clinician.
Mm.
And in part, the things I was interested in and wanted to do were more that way inclined.
Yeah.
So I think that's not so much advice, but to contextualize that there are different parts to and
Yeah.
different ways in which we can put to practice everything we learn in medicine, internship, and ComServe, even if you do medical officer years or you do registrar time. A lot that we learn and experience and do in medicine is so transferable. It's just a matter of we don't know how to package it in that way. Constantly managing stakeholders. You're
Yeah.
constantly dealing with things that are in tension. You're constantly managing multiple situations you see that a job ad with someone who can adapt to high pressure environments. Hey, you've managed multiple wards overnight. No one died, you were
Mm-hmm.
okay. All of those things are skills, and sometimes we don't see it as completely related and useful.
Right.
But I don't think anyone should do medical school ever again. But would I do the process and the journey again? 100%. Because part of it, I think I blossomed and really grew into myself and who I am today through that. But I think it's important to know that even when people leave clinical medicine and go do something else, there is still the stigma of, what a waste.
Mm.
But it's not, because who knows, maybe you wouldn't have done what you did if you hadn't done medicine, right? You wouldn't have had whatever
Right.
experience that led you to that next
Right.
thing. And sometimes if you leave for any other reason, that's also okay because we're becoming more primed to that within medicine that some people don't enjoy it. Some people find it difficult or find it just the angst and the frustrations and all the things that occur in medicine. They maybe are just like, no, actually, I can't function in this kind of environment, notwithstanding all the other personality frustrations that occur in other jobs. But it's just like, hey, this is not the job for me.
Mm.
Feeling bad and like a self-deprecating way of thinking that, oh, I'm leaving, but now I had taken someone else's spot. No, you got that spot. You were in the spot. You chose
Yeah.
to let it go. If someone else can't take that spot, I don't think that's very helpful for the
Mm.
individual to think like that, particularly when you're trying to justify whether or not this is the right thing to do. But again, to also look around, there are people that are still clinicians who left, this, did that,
Mm.
then came back. You don't have to do the path back to back. Med school, internship, ComServe, reg time, then you're a consultant. It doesn't have to be that way. If you have other interests, hold space for that because unfortunately, you don't want medicine or any job to be the nucleus of your life because if the nucleus is crumbling, then everything is crumbling. And that's my biggest push of like treat medicine as beautiful and rewarding and wholesome and all the things that it can be and often is. Treat it not as this calling or this virtuous thing that you're doing. Treat it as a job. And this is not to take away from what medicine does have and maybe other jobs don't have, but it allows you as the individual to be intentional to carve out time outside of
Yeah.
medicine because that's also something that's not drilled into us
Mm.
as a, hey, I'm not gonna, as medicine, say to medical students or doctors and whatnot, no, guys, if you have free time, go have fun. No, if you're not using it, I will take it from you. Medicine will say, okay, come, give me your free time. Stay longer at the hospital. Do this, do that. Obviously, it needs to be said. I don't want to be misquoted that you don't just leave and abdicate your responsibilities to
Mm.
go do your personal things, but knowing that the time that you're meant to be there is done, the handovers were done, go rest, go
Yeah.
for the run, go for the hike, choose to work in the hospital or the province that's close to the things you care about, because maybe the hospital you've chosen is the right one for the training, but it might not be for the rest of your life. Do you need to move? Yeah. Some of these decisions are taken away from us, at least from a ComServe and internship role, where the choices are not as open. But I think that investment in the things we care about beyond are important,
Yeah.
because otherwise medicine can unfortunately just take.
Welcome. I'm Dr. Maria Christodoulou, and this is the Awakening Doctor podcast, a space where we discover the personal stories of those who work in the medical and health professions. Join me as I explore the hopes, the fears, the aspirations, and the real-life challenges of those who carry the title, responsibility, and privilege of being a doctor. So joining myself and producer Amy Kay today is Dr. Hloni Bookholane, medical doctor and senior associate at the Boston Consulting Group, a former Fulbright scholar with a master's in public health from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and the author of Becoming a Doctor, Learnings and Unlearnings About Life and the Politics of Medicine. Welcome, Hloni. It's great to have you with us today.
Thank you. It's good to be here and very lovely to meet you both, you and Amy.
Hello, Amy. How are you?
I'm great. Lovely to meet you too. I'm excited about this one.
So, Hloni, where do we begin to tell your story?
In medicine, they always say the best answer is the one that says, it depends. It depends what you're interested in. But since we're talking about medicine and the things that are related to that, we can start with how I ended up in medicine.
Sounds like a good place. So where does that journey begin?
Going through the reflection post-medical school and thinking about, wow, it's done, it's finished. I had to go back and think like, well, where did it start? And I was surrounded by a lot of people who either had family members, whether brothers, sisters, parents who'd been through medicine. So they were primed to end up in medicine for, among other reasons. I didn't have that. Some people they knew they wanted to do medicine from a very young age. Also didn't have that. So I ended up saying out loud, I want to do medicine when I was 17. Before that, there was the goal and idea of becoming a professional squash player. That was the goal. That didn't work out, partly because I realized, okay, there's a big gap between myself and the rest of the squash players. Never mind the world, but in South Africa. And then, having a good, solid academic background was then a good option to have. It wasn't the worst fallback option to like, oh, I can go and study a good degree. And medicine was the chosen option. That's how that started.
What do you think made it the chosen option? What brought it into your awareness if it was not those things that you've already mentioned that normally bring other people to medicine?
I think in part, similar to how when you go to a restaurant and you haven't been to that restaurant before, you sort of look at the menu, you quickly rule out what you don't want to be doing, right? And then the last few options that I had, based on people I knew, my parents, my mom's a psychologist, an academic, so is my dad. My sister was doing finance, and I didn't want to do any of those. So those were ruled out up front. And then it was to be a lawyer or engineering, accounting. Again, options that they didn't really jump out at me. And then medicine, for lack of a better description, that sounds nice. You're engaging with people, not so much the helping people, you're engaging with people in a day-to-day. And it seemed very interesting. So after that, it was the health sciences. So it was either medicine or physio. And maybe I should have mentioned. So I applied for medicine up front and I didn't get in. So physio was the second option and did that. And then I found, okay, this is very interesting. But physio is a very specialized part of the medical curriculum. And I wanted to do more and understand more. And was the drive and the push to do medicine. And in many ways, then it became, wanting to help people in a more comprehensive way to understand medicine and pathology and what you can do as a health practitioner in a more comprehensive way.
So you wrote this book, and we'll talk about the book a bit later. And the book was a reflection on your time at medical school, and you wrote it while you were still an intern. But I'm thinking about that young man who decided to go to medical school and who had this idea of working with people, engaging with people, what did you think medical school was going to be like when you signed up, as opposed to what you discovered it to be like later? Like, what was the fantasy about what you would be doing and what you would be learning?
The fantasy was, oh, I know I'd be learning a lot. I'd be studying a lot. I'd be spending a lot of time doing that. And then there would be the, ooh, got your stethoscope, you're in the hospital, you're getting involved, you're doing the things, you're making decisions, or rather, you're contributing to the decisions that are made about and with people's health and illness and so on. And I think I always enjoyed being around people and engaging with them. But this was a different kind of engagement, a more in-depth, and you can't hide in that environment. None of us can, because you're the most vulnerable in that space, but also you're the most honest, or at least you end up being the most honest. And I think I've spoken about how I ended up into medicine. But what kept me there was keep saying to people, I think I've met the entire spectrum of personalities and types of people within medicine, both from people that are practicing clinicians, patients, the people that come and go in between that. You see the full spectrum there. And that's beyond a pathology point of view, just the type of person.
Right.
And I think the idea and the wow factor that I had imagined, I saw that. I experienced that, but definitely that was not the majority of it. I soon realized that, oh, okay, the Grey's Anatomy scenes are few and far between. And if there are many, they are definitely broken up by the regular humdrum of hospitals, of healthcare, of the entire process.
I'm smiling at the comparison to Grey's Anatomy, because I remember when I used to watch Grey's Anatomy thinking, where was this when I was a medical student? I didn't have time for all these making out in on-call rooms and doing all these things that these guys are getting up to.
Well, that's the point, right? Because you see that, and then you look at the rooms and the spaces in which doctors that are working overnight get to sleep and put their heads down when the time allows. And you're like, I don't even want to lie down on this bed by myself.
Yes.
But they are doing it with each other with fewer clothes. Like, no, that should not be happening. And it's funny, I only watched Grey's Anatomy in its entirety the week after I graduated. So I binge watched, I think, 8 seasons. And it was, I think I even speak about it in the book, it was funny for me to be now watching Grey's Anatomy after I finished medical school, before starting internship. And I was able to see the forest for the trees and be like, okay, wait, this is the story that you're selling to the person who's sitting at home watching while they're having dinner, pulling at the heartstrings and all of those things. Yay, great. All the dramatization of things that happen in healthcare, yeah, that doesn't matter. But the storyline of that informs what becomes sensationalized for the viewer. I've seen that. I've seen that kind of doctor. And this is before I started working. People have taken a personality test after watching Friends, seeing like which character on Friends would they be. Well,
Right.
I took one for Grey's Anatomy. The first time I did it, I got Meredith. Then the next time I got Derek. But I thought I could be any one of these people in terms of like the personalities and the person that they bring to their medical specialty. And I think that's true for everyone in medicine. It's like, yeah, depending who you ask, you might be a MacDreamy or a Max Deemy, or you might be the person they never want to see in the hospital. You could be someone's crush.
Yeah.
Or you could be someone's nightmare to have to call in the hospital.
Right.
So it was fascinating watching that after the fact.
That was a few years ago. When you think about medicine today, how does it feel? How does it compare to Grey's Anatomy and or your experience?
I don't think it's that different. And I say that because when I was going through it and speaking to my mentors, people who'd been specialists for 10 plus years, maybe 20 years, some of the reflections I was having with them and sharing with them and frustrations and even the good things, it was stuff that they were still experiencing or could see, yes, that hasn't changed. You're going to get that kind of experience today. We got it 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. I think what's changing is how people interact with the health system and the doctors, the nurses, the physios, the OTs. People are coming in a bit more informed about what the hell's going on. But I think healthcare in general has become not this thing that you need when you're in trouble or when you're having a bad day, much like lawyers. No one's having a good day when they go see a doctor or a lawyer, for the most part. And now it's been thrust into the front of mind, like recently, political elections, political decisions, and COVID was a great example of if we're not paying attention to what's going on out there, the politics, the elections, the geopolitics, all those things, don't pay attention, but you're going to see it coming into your hospital, dressed in that lady, that man, that person. And you can draw a straight line if you tune into it that, oh, what's happening with US elections, what's happening with UK elections, or the decisions made at policy levels in these countries, particularly those that give development aid funding. You're like, oh, wait, that clinic has closed down because they are funded by a particular organization. And
who's done their research, got the data they wanted, and has now moved on.
Or I think this week, the last 10 days really has been, particularly from a US point of view. And look, I'm not pointing fingers and calling anyone out, but the reality was that there was a decision made in the new administration and it's had ripple effects across the world. It's scary when it's not completely mind-boggling.
You spoke in the book about, in the early days, naively thinking that medicine was apolitical and that eventually changed for you. And that's what you're referring to now. So how did that transformation in your thinking happen?
Slowly, but it happened. There's definitely a acknowledgement I need to give to going through medical school and having 4 years of university protests happening while I was in medical school. I think that was a big catalyst for what might have been already happening for me, processing and seeing how, wait, medicine is political. Or at the very least, it is directly impacted by politics. And the university protests were part of the unlearning for myself from a personal, male, and social privilege lens, but also realizing that, oh, okay, I have to pay attention to what's going on at the university level, even though med school is this little island at a different place. And there is this false pedestal that people still are at med school put on that there's protests happening at the University of Cape Town, but not at the medical
on the main
school.
campus, right?
And it's like, no, but the problems that are being discussed and the tensions that are occurring, there are students at medical school who are going through that same thing. And there's a tension between, well, I'm a medical student and I'm faced with this problem that the university is grappling with, but I cannot, or I don't feel like I can go and be part of that. And I saw that people at med school, classmates, and then eventually the proverbial wall broke. And it clicked, and I was like, okay, becoming, not that I wasn't aware, but there was a version of me who was like, look, yes, I'm paying attention, but I think medicine is apolitical. And that was a very young and naive way of thinking, if I'm being very generous to myself.
So you spoke about being a student during 4 years of protest action on the campus. Are there any highlights that stand out for you about that time? Pivotal moments in terms of those shifts in your thinking?
I think it was number one, when the Rhodes statue was removed on Upper Campus in 2015, there were cameras there. It was on the news. It was being broadcast live. And I remember being in one of the hospital clinical education centers, watching it on my phone. And when I looked back at that moment, penny dropped. I was like, you were there, but you were not there, right? It was where you needed to be, just mentally was the hospital is going to be okay without a third-year medical student. Just being engaged with what's going on. I was watching it on my phone. And I think that was the aha moment. And I'm not saying I have any regrets, I've come a long way from just actually paying attention to things that might not directly impact me, but they do impact maybe things I'm interested in or what I want to be doing. Also, just seeing how the reporting was done about how students were engaging and how there was confrontation and there was anger and it wasn't civil and people didn't feel safe. But the health sciences campus at UCT and how those engagements would be happening. Yes, it was tense, but conversations were happening. There was progress being made despite the tensions, despite the animosity, despite tears during those plenary sessions. And I'm sure it was uncomfortable at times, particularly if you were the late Professor Bongani Mayosi was the dean at the time, and now your office is occupied, but they found a way to engage. And I think it was great to see that in real time. If anything, that has been something that's informed entirely my view of, look, we can have a difficult discussion that we are fundamentally disagreeing on our starting points, but we can have the discussion. There's been benefits that go beyond my role as someone who's a working professional, and that I think even just engaging with other people, it was very helpful.
Well, one of the things you talk about in the book is the notion of intersectionality and how we get so rigid and fixed in our views and perspectives about one particular theme or one particular issue or injustice, and then we blind ourselves to the ways in which we are perpetrators of other injustices in other areas or in other domains. And I thought you were really articulate in how you spoke about that challenge.
I will say I don't remember everything I wrote. I appreciate that reflection and that sentiment. I think it's important. For example, I think if you consider a romantic relationship, there are numerous examples we have about how to love another person. There's movies, there's books, there's a whole plethora of resources. If you're stuck, how do I show my love to this person? How do I care for this person? But to fight
Yeah.
with love, to fight with love. We don't have examples of that other than the practical, okay, this is how I saw people in my family or around me arguing or disagreeing, and that becomes the template that you
Right.
build off of. And then sometimes the clashes are not because these two people or these two groups fundamentally disagree. It's just the fighting languages are just different.
Yeah.
They just want to come at you, and the others are like, whoa, wait, can you book an appointment and then we have the fight? I'm busy with something else. I think I've grown to develop a bit of patience because I think just from myself, I know I'll argue like I'm correct, but I've learned and continuing to learn to listen as if I'm wrong, completely wrong. What's built into the listening when someone else is speaking, when you're hearing the other perspectives, it's okay. Maybe you're completely wrong and this is the gospel, but then it's tennis, it's symbiotic. For that to work out for me, the other person also needs to be at that level.
I'm thinking about the paradox of how we like to think about science as empirical and rational and logical, and how there are facts and there is evidence and that we base our decisions on that. And what you're talking about now is the reality that in most situations, depending on which perspective you take, the facts can be skewed and they can be presented in a multitude of different ways. And so what's true and what's right is so context dependent and so lens dependent. Which lens are we using when we look at something?
Exactly. But again, that being said, there is also a good faith and a bad faith way of having these arguments where you come into something thinking, okay, this is going to be a good faith debate, and sometimes it isn't. Again, maybe that's how that group or those people, it's always in bad faith or whatnot. And okay, how do I adapt to this way of doing things? And then it's for us to decide whether you want to continue.
What do you think it is about you that makes you willing to question your own assumptions and perceptions? What do you think it is about your understanding and experience of conflict that makes you able to step back and say, maybe I need to listen. Maybe I need to consider the possibility that I'm wrong. Because again, based on what I just said about medicine, so often the assumption is that you need to be the expert. You need to offer the expert opinion, and your expert opinion is evidence-based and informed. And so to shift into a space of, I'm going to be willing to listen with an open mind and an open heart and consider the possibility that I might be wrong.
I don't know if I'm entirely singular in that, but I think for me, it might stem from I really don't like being wrong. I really dislike it, particularly because when I do then make my argument on case, I'm making it fully backing it like this. I am not wrong, right? So I have to be able to then, okay, if I am wrong, either it's an apology or to adjust how strongly held a particular viewpoint has been. And sometimes it's not as simple as right and wrong. Sometimes it's just that, look, maybe there are other things you need to take into account in this belief you hold with so much conviction. I've been surrounded by, whether it's at home, whether it's at university, and everything, the people around me that I met in that journey. It was people and has been people where I did feel like they modeled that kind of behavior, where I could challenge them and not challenge them in like a provocative way. I could ask why, and they explain, and then I ask another why, but that doesn't make sense. And then I ask why again. They might get tired of my whys, but I can see that in my thinking and churning, I have a minimum of 5 whys. That I can see them that, hold on. They are also firming up what they believe in.
Right.
And I've seen it in an academic point of view where go through the peer review process when you submit an article to a scientific journal. You've all, as the group of authors, worked on this. Some of you have done bigger portions of it. You submit it, it gets peer reviewed, it gets sent back with comments, and there's all these other questions. And sometimes it's not a question that they're saying it's wrong, but there's a context that they don't have, and they're looking at the results you're sharing and they say this doesn't make sense, and what's required there is, actually I'm not changing that opinion or that paragraph, but it's just about adding the context,
right,
that then clicks in for the reader to like, this makes sense. Fine. Even in writing the book, write the first chapter or bunch of chapters, you submit them, get questions, and I'm like, no, actually I want to keep this chapter, but now I need to make it better to justify keeping it. So that's a long-winded way of highlighting how different parts of my life have constantly reinforced that way of thinking,
right.
but I can only see it in hindsight. Therapy as well has been great. They hold you accountable there.
But you have to be willing to sign up for it, which isn't always easy.
Yeah, and maybe because I was a very naughty child as well. I learned how to say sorry. I'm like, well, yes, it was me that broke the plant or that messed up that thing. And there was no hiding. I had to take accountability, at least, whatever accountability 8-year-old needs to take.
Right. You talked in the book about your schooling and your time at, I think it was Transkei Primary School, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
And how you were often in trouble because you were, in your words, a naughty child.
I think I might have said a naughty little shit, but yes.
I think you did say that, actually. I think you did. And then you also contrasted it with your experiences at an elite private boys' boarding school in East London. Do you want to say anything about that?
For the public record, correct in saying that the elite private boys' school is in brackets because it's considered as such by, depending who you ask, but I think if you go and Google, it's a former Model C school, and that's just semantics. I think the difference in my experience from Transkei Primary School and the high school I went to, it was co-ed. I don't know if that really played a role between 8 and 13. It was a very different environment. Different in the sense that there was a particular type of way to be a leader. There's a particular type of way to be considered good looking. Not good looking in the sense of teachers wanting to date you, but it's what's baked into the zeitgeist of those schools, such that when you interact with the girls' school, or everyone is now replicating subconsciously what they're being fed in the school, speaking the way I do. I learned how to speak English way before I went to that school. But I think there's definitely a bad habit that picked up. If someone doesn't speak English in a particular, particularly a person of color, there was an inherent assumption of intelligence based on the English accent in which they spoken. I'm not going to stand here and say 100% I learned that from the high school, but I can't remember paying that much attention to that pre going to the school. To a point where I remember in med school, there was a guy who in one of the, it's called problem-based learning sessions, where you basically go through a case that addresses different parts of the learning curriculum, and they had the answer and they had a vernacular accent. Very nice guy, but my inherent assumption was that they're probably not going to get this right. And again, that was the unlearning that I was doing. Well, first self-awareness, and then unlearning, and then figuring out, but why did that become a marker of intelligence? And it's not unique to that school, right?
No,
You
absolutely.
see this still, even on the global stage. There's a particular set of unspoken, not standards, but things that we want to see.
Right.
So not gonna lie and say I regret going to the school. I think I learned a lot. It wasn't a bad school. I had a good education. I enjoyed boarding school, got into trouble there as well. But would I send my kids? If I had a son, would I send them to a boys' school? Ooh, I don't know. Would I send them to that boys' school? Definitely not.
What makes you say that?
Because of my experience there.
So I feel like you've been articulate and very cryptic in a way. You've kind of alluded to the fact that there was stuff around race and language and privilege and social stratification that got in the way. Are there any particular stories you want to share?
No, I don't think it's that either. It's not like there were a minority of Black students at the school, but I think the issue that, and I say this in the book as well, is that the things that were bad at the school were not unique to that boys' school. But I think for me, if I was the sole decision maker on what school they go to and they're a boy, I wouldn't send them to that school because the experience I had there was it was an environment where people, maybe the teachers, felt like they had gotten to a level at which they should not and were not meant to be questioned or challenged. And I was just like, no, I'm not interested in that. And you know what? Maybe the next boys' school that I would choose, for example, would have the same situation, but it would be agnostic to my experience.
Right.
It would be a new, different experience here. I've never dealt with this environment. I'm not an old boy. I don't have any of that. And that would be, I'm not saying that that's good, that's better. I wouldn't have to go back there. I
Right.
don't have any feelings of that I was treated in a racist way at the school. Definitely not.
Right.
At least not to my face. I'll tell you that.
Right. So one of the things that you've alluded to, and you mentioned it very early on, was about being socially privileged, being a male, and that comes with its own set of privileges. And then you're also a young Black South African man. And there are a lot of stereotypes and assumptions about Black South African young men. And I'm wondering how that played out for you as a medical student, if at all, whether that was something that you experienced as a challenge.
Yo, what a question. Look, nothing's jumping out at me up front. I'll preface by saying, one, I think I thrived in medical school. I loved medical school. If anything, I think I really grew into myself and the confident version of myself and the gregarious and just knowing how to engage different people, going through different things. I could go from one environment where it's okay, life and death situation with this individual, and the next one it's, oh, this is a happy doctor's visit. And that experience was, I think, truly molded me in a good way. I think the race, the male privilege, and guess social. I mean, I've spoken to the social privilege part. I think one, I didn't have a bursary or my parents paid for my university fees. So I think that is reflective of how I was thinking about fees must fall protests in the form that they impacted me personally.
Right.
But I also caveat that in the book where I had a fight with a friend where I was engaging with this stuff and thinking about, well, this is terrible that people are being not academically excluded, but they're being financially excluded. And like, is that right? Not having any answers of my own, but this friend, not so many words, says that, look, it's not something that they'll ever have to deal with. They're not really interested in. And then I was like, but hold on. If I was financially excluded now, would you care about it? Because I'm your friend, would you care about it then? And then we had this back and forth fight, and that's when I left. Because maybe in fairness to them, for me, it was, oh, I was now grappling with all of this and seeing, oh, hold on. You don't have to be poor to care about people that are struggling financially. You don't have to be living in a place that just had the hurricane to care about people that are affected by that. That's the biggest thing that I took away from medical school, that, oh, socioeconomic privilege is because once you're in med school, for the most part, then you're all standardized now. The hardest part is getting in. Once you're in, cool. Now you have to study, blah, 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 become a doctor. Yes, race and microaggressions do play a role in the different environments, whether depending what medical school you go to or depending what patient population you work with, those things come up. For some people, it was more in their face. For others, it was just microaggressions, not as overt. And there are the things that happen without you knowing that they've happened. I can definitely say I didn't have any of the ones to my face.
Right. Well, and I guess I'm listening to you and thinking, I also have to question the assumption that you must have had microaggressions or racist interactions as a young Black man at university. And again, I don't want to be naive about the world. I'm sure they were there. But there's also, I guess, in the same way that you're saying you don't have to be poor to care about fees must fall, I'm wondering if there's an assumption or an expectation, even on my part as a white person, that as a young Black man, you should care, whether you have privilege or not. And that there's almost an expectation that whichever way we want to look at it, white people should care that Black people in this country don't have economic privilege, and or young Black people with economic privilege have to carry some sort of burden of responsibility. I'm just thinking out loud.
Look, I think we can definitely pick up on that when I interview you for my podcast. But to the point that there's the assumption, consciously or subconsciously, the assumption that, hey, because an individual is X, Y, Z, they should care. I think a great example of maybe why we shouldn't have that assumption has been the US elections recently, where there was a lot of, you are a woman. If we just use the heterosexual or the binary definitions, you're a woman and you should care that this person is running to be re-elected because they're going to take away women's health or take further steps to limit access to women's healthcare. Or you are a person from South America, name your country, and you're in America, you should care. And it's like, well, actually, what you find out in the different interviews, and say, well, some people are like, actually, this is good for us because we are not one issue groups of people. Yes, I should care about this one issue that Hloni is running for president, and we disagree on that. But he's going to make chuckles cheaper, and that's what I really care about more. So I'm going to vote for him because that's more important to me. Politics aside, it becomes difficult to try and bucket people. I think that's where good conversations are helpful, but also for us to have the grace that, hey, I'm going to make a mistake, you're going to make a mistake, to not assume that it's constantly bad faith, that someone misgenders you or someone mispronounces your name. All these little things, they're not in malice all the time, but it's hard if you are constantly experiencing that in your particular environment. And those things are in tension constantly. And I don't have an answer how to solve it.
Well, it's interesting you brought up politics specifically, and you said if Hloni was running for president, because one of the questions I wrote down on my notes was, do you have any political aspirations for your future?
Do I have political aspirations? Short answer right now, no.
Okay.
Do I have aspirations for some form of higher office, to be working within a higher office, whether it's global organization or you name it? From a national politics role, I don't know. I think inherently I'm just a bit too impatient for some of the song and dance that needs to happen. That's part and parcel of that. And maybe the people that end up there were also just like, oh my goodness, there's a performance that is required as part of doing this. And it's the soggy tomato in the sandwich that you have to put up with. But I wouldn't write it off. And I say that not thinking like, you know what, I'm not going to admit it now. I don't. I have visioned myself, I could be your chief of staff or be the spokesperson for that person who has that role. Chief person who's just fielding all the questions and making sure, no, that was taken out of context. This is what was said. What interests me, it's more the engagement part of it, where you're engaging with people. You're reporters, cool. You greet the people, you have banter back and forth, and then you see the article that's published. The next time they come to the press briefing, you're like, but you're always writing what I don't say. What's going on? And maybe that's just me watching too many American TV shows about people in higher office. Short answer, I don't have anything in mind right now.
Tell us about your time in the US.
Loved it.
How did you end up there? I know it was a Fulbright scholarship, but what made you decide to do a master's in public health?
Traveled to the US at least since 2015. I think I've traveled there 3 times prior to moving in 2019. medical school is where everything just clicked. Fourth year medical school, we were doing our internal medicine rotation and we were able to spend some time in the renal unit. So in the Western Cape, or at least in Cape Town, the renal unit has these meetings where they review people that are potentially eligible for chronic dialysis. But that meeting in which they make this decision, it's a dual decision that's being made. For you to qualify for chronic dialysis, you need to be a transplant candidate.
Right.
So basically, everyone who's getting dialysis is a candidate for transplant. And the patients that are presented there, social worker, clinician, dietitian, I might be forgetting another aspect that's discussed. Those elements of the patient are discussed, and there's a scoring system. And ultimately, I was sitting there, and the patient who was discussed was medically fit, qualifying. Their dietitian, they qualified on that front, but then they scored too low on the psychosocial element. I stand corrected. I think they might have been unemployed at the time, and I think where they lived, those were limiting. I think the criteria was even taken to the South African Human Rights Commission as being not fair, but it withstood that for better or worse. And seeing that and experiencing that, I was like, hold on. Medicine is not just about us being able to give you the medical treatment or the medical device and whatnot. At least in that situation, you needed to be medically fit and medically qualified from your social and psychosocial elements, because should you get a transplant, all of those factors play a role in what predicts the probability of you rejecting that transplanted kidney.
Right.
And that's how I got into organ donation research, organ donation transplantation, and the HIV-associated kidney disease. And obviously the first HIV positive to HIV positive kidney transplant was done at Groote. So all of these things played a role. I could see that, oh, hold on. This is not just a clinical problem that requires clinicians. There's a public health element to this, because transplantation is the only medical service that cannot occur without the public participating. So if someone needs a heart transplant, I need to, as a potential organ donor, say, hey, I'm willing to donate my heart. God forbid something happens to me and you can donate my heart. The rate limiting step isn't medical intervention and medical ability. It's that individual and the broader public knowing about organ donation. So that research and the publications and the conferences, I met different people, ended up going to Hopkins to visit and loved it. And I was like, okay, Grey's Anatomy. They speak a lot about this place. I mean, I wasn't going to work as a doctor there, but the public health idea, doing a master of public health, truly now understand why people get sick rather than you're now dealing with them when they get sick. Then what I was motivated to understand and learn about and being there was just so, I can't even put it into words. It was very exciting. So applied for the Fulbright scholarship and applied for the universities, and I visited a couple of the universities that I applied to, and that's how I ended up in the US. I signed the book contract end of May, and then I started writing the book when I moved to the US during my master's. I submitted the first chapter in September of 2019 and loved the experience of being there. And I always say to people, why did you love America so much? The people that would ask me that particular question. I've had a very particular experience in the US. More often than not, it was in the big cities. It was around a lot of international groups of people in the US, together with people that are from the US. And it was just a very different experience, much like anyone would have when you go wherever. And I think my experience is around learning with other people that were just as interested in what I was interested in. Young people from different countries, people who are doing the exciting jobs and the things. Oh, wait, I want to work in that kind of environment. And this person is coming from there to do the Masters of Public Health. So it was amazing to see that public health isn't, you don't enter public health because you're a clinician or a medical student or a doctor. There were lawyers, there were statisticians, data scientists, people who worked at the White House as interns, and then the roles that come out of there and where these people end up. I was like, oh, this is what I'm talking about. This is where I want to be. And loved it. Loved it. And had love in America, which was also great.
Tell us more about that.
Met amazing people, like I said. Relationships happened. Look, they didn't last,
I was
unfortunately.
about to ask, oh, are those relationships ongoing?
No, they're not ongoing, but the relationship itself still exists.
Mm.
Really good friend. She's from Argentina,
Mhm.
married, just had a baby, still in contact. And we're like catching up about how, wow, that was almost 6 years ago. That
Yeah.
experience of being in the US, living in the US, and how different or how similar we still are to those
Mm.
people. But so much has changed. Same, but different.
How would you say that time impacted you? How did it change or influence who you are? How did it shape who you become?
From the medicine, being a medical student environment, it enhanced what I was receiving at UCT, Crediskia, the people that I developed relationships as like mentors and observing how the care exists from lecturers, professors to students and what is available when people given the means that exist here. And then I just saw that and experienced that elevated
Mm.
at Hopkins. I had good people and still have good people, DCT, Crescia, and then I got there and met other good people. Those
Mm.
relationships still stand today. The person who ended up being my advisor during my master's, I met her colleague at a running track event. She invited me to a seminar that she was hosting about diabetes and HIV. Went there, and that became my academic home when I was there
Mm. Sure.
and still keep in contact. I met up with that professor actually when I was in Italy last year. And the relationships that I've built in different places, if you were to draw a map and have like one dot and then see things that go to that, there's tethers from all different parts that I still hold attached, that I am forever grateful for those relationships and those people that I've met.
And you talk about that time, and I mean, you said a couple of times that you loved it, and I think you described it at some point when we were chatting last time as one of the best years of your life. And as you talk about it, I have a sense of obviously how expansive and transformative it was for you, but you get quite animated and your energy sort of expands, and you talk about all these people and you're smiling. So for our listeners who can't see you, there's a sense of that something opened up in you for that or in that time. And I'm curious how it was to then come back to South Africa, back into your internship year during the time of COVID.
To the animation point, it's 100%. To the listeners, I feel myself getting animated and speaking to how what was different or rather the same. It
Hmm.
was you have an idea, and I had people who I could pressure test ideas and thoughts, get challenged, and it's like, no, think about this more, think about it in a different way. There, that was supercharged, and I was in an environment that it was, you have an idea. Is it a good idea? How can we not, we don't have the resources, we don't have the
Hmm.
fund. It was, how can we make it happen? What do you need? What can we do? And man, when you just have all this energy and you're excited,
Yeah.
and what you're hearing is that no, this is not going to work. It's more like, okay, but how can we make this happen? Actually,
Hmm.
let me introduce you to this person who's working on this, and I think fantastic. And the great segue to your question, when I came back to internship mid COVID, I think more so to the point about that experience and then coming back here and you point out, okay, well, not that this is a problem and I'm frustrated and I'm throwing my hands in the air. That wasn't baked into the way of thinking. And I'm talking about my peers, not sort of professors and whatnot. And I don't know if I'm being unfair or rather I was being unfair at the time, just feeling like I think I've outgrown my peers. They're
Hmm.
more clinically advanced than I am now, but the way of problem solving and thinking about particularly health related problems, I've advanced further in that. And that's
Hmm.
in part because that's what I was doing over a year. That's what I went in to go do. But coming back to a clinical environment and just the system relegates you to just being the
Yeah.
intern or the
Yeah.
consultant doctor. And I remember chatting to one mentor, even in therapy, and it was like, look, you left and went and did the things. Amazing. Well done. Great. But just remember that unfortunately, the role in which you're in, that per cell number you have with the Department of Health,
Mm-hmm.
the ambit of your roles and responsibilities is not to think about How can we fix the system? How can we actually develop a better way and questioning, but this doesn't make sense, rather than just do it. I was in a constant tension with that of, okay, fine, this is not my job, but I couldn't switch it off when you're dealing now with the situation of, well, this doesn't make sense. Why are we still doing it like this? This is inefficient. This is that. And it was hard. It was frustrating. And that was something that I hadn't prepared adequately enough for, because I came back from an environment where, if anything, it was, oh, we want to hear what you have to say. We're interested to hear what you have to say. We want your ideas, to an environment that didn't really care about that, until it was like, oh, you know, so and so, you've done this, and that. Okay, we'll listen to what you have to say, which was a bit demotivating, because the idea is still the idea, irrespective of what the person has. I think a big part of it was, there was one part ego, there was one part, I'm not just an intern when I came back. And there was one part, okay, yes, this is not my job to think about these things, but how are you not thinking about these things?
Right.
It's all good and well to say that, look, this is just the way it is. But I felt at my most frustrated that we got to a point where the problem became the justification for not having a solution, or not thinking about a solution. Metaphorically hit my head millions of times against the wall. Thanks to my beloved mentors and friends that held space for me when I was just ranting and upset, and I had to contextualize and say, look, it was just like that when I was there. I'm like, that doesn't make me feel better right now. Nothing's changed.
But, I guess what you highlight is how certainly medical school training is so focused on a particular outcome, which is to churn out interns and ComServe doctors who will then go on to become the clinicians of the future. And there isn't much space in that for thinking about anything beyond the day-to-day requirements of the curriculum, in terms of the time pressure and the demands on your energy in terms of night shifts and all of that. And it feels like you had this unique opportunity to step out of the rat race, to step off the treadmill and go and put yourself in an entirely new environment and be exposed to people from other disciplines and other countries, and almost like a think tank, and be able to expand your mind and your way of seeing things. You come back with a new lens and fresh perspectives, and you see things differently, but now you're expected to be an intern and fit into the same box that you left. And that's really hard. But I also wonder about the value and the benefit of that. And if there was space in the medical curriculum for people to step out for a while and immerse themselves in a new environment related to their field, but not the day-to-day demands of training, and how new ideas or innovation might emerge from those spaces.
Exactly. And the US has that model in their training of clinicians and people when they're specializing. It's built in, at least when we're talking about stepping out to go do a master's or stepping out to go do a PhD. It's baked into the curriculum and the system that is not an anomaly for someone to do that. If anything, it's becoming the norm.
Right.
And again, in defense of the people that I held frustration and resentment towards, I think the people that I grew up as like through medical school and whatnot, that I was surrounded by and ended up being mentored by. I didn't realize that the different things that they did outside of their specializing journeys was not the norm, because now I see them and I'm like, oh, actually, you are one of in your specialty. You are one of in this specialty. You're one of in this country, one of 5 or maybe 10 in that. And hindsight, always 2020. It's stepping away allowed me to be like, okay, you know what? I acknowledge these things, but there was also a responsibility on my part that in the frustration, I couldn't see it. But yes, to building into the system how to people to take a break, not take a break to go relax and whatnot, but such that people can explore and think about the different parts of medicine and healthcare. But at the moment, that seems like a big ask given what's happening in the healthcare system, at least from a human resources point of view. It's tough.
So there you are, you come back, you're an intern, you're experiencing all these frustrations, you have ideas, you have to step back a little bit, and you're fortunate enough to have mentors who hold space. What came next? What did you do next?
I finished internship. And as I was finishing internship, I was just heartful. I thought, you know what? I'm done. I'm not going to do ComServe. It's not worth it for me, because look, I'm probably not going to practice. And this is not because of a lack of love and enjoyment of medicine and being a doctor. I didn't leave the field feeling bitter and I'll never encourage someone, or rather, I'd actively discourage people from doing it. But I was just like, no, if you have multiple dimensions and ways of thinking and things that are interesting to you, really think hard if this is the route to take, because here are my frustrations. And to that, I think the biggest frustration was it was a rigid, it still is, very rigid system. In part, maybe it has to be when you're working, right? Because it's an apprenticeship model. It's see one, do one, teach one. You can't progress to the next rank and level, particularly when you consider specializing roles. It's a step ladder. But what I saw, what that came with, was there were people who, the further up they got on that step ladder, it was assumed that the further up they get, the lower the amount of pushback that they need to be getting from other people, or questioning that they need to be getting, to a point where when they graduate and qualify as specialists or whatever the thing is that gives them a particular amount of authority, they are now beyond being questioned or challenged or disagreed with.
Right.
And look, I told you, minimum of 5 whys. The clash was constant. I had those clash where it's to a point where it was someone said, yeah, they'll call their consultant. This is what they said. And a consultant being like the attending or the specialist doctor. And I said, that's fine, call them. But my question is still going to be the question. Why is this the way it is? And that's not an answer to sort of give someone a, well, my mom said so, or my dad said so, or
We've always done
boss
it
said
that
so.
way.
Okay, fine. But I need rationale right here, because again, maybe it's a me thing. I need to understand why I'm doing this way, because if I don't understand why, my mathematical calculus is that I'm going to keep questioning it. And if I keep questioning it, I'm going to keep getting frustrated. And if you're not giving me the answer, my cycle just gets worse and worse and worse. And the way I interact then with that way of thinking, I become much more prickly in that interaction, and often to my detriment, because now I'm getting worked up and frustrated and I can't let things go. And I said this to you before, I think in medical school, people become emotionally stunted, that because you're learning so much and so many big things about health and disease and death and dying, and you have to mature so quickly relative to your peers doing other degrees, because by the time you start working and you've seen and experienced probably the equivalent amount that someone is now experiencing as they start working, you've experienced that level of stress or angst by the very nature of what medicine and healthcare degrees are. But now you start working, and because of what's inherent to medicine, it's a step ladder growth. That also then reinforces the authority type thing, where the decision making is at the top, and you've got this anxious overachiever who's now working as a doctor, and they just do as they're told, or they choose not to question, or they question not enough because nature, nurture, the way medicine is. And then that cycle just replicates. And then you get this weird guy called Hloni questioning something all of a sudden. And it becomes almost like wait, are you questioning me? And wait, are we not allowed to question? I'm certainly not saying that these people, again, were malicious, that I had frustrations with, and what they represented in my interactions with them and what I saw and experienced. But my goodness, it's hard. And
what did you find most frustrating?
That you could just get dismissed because of the role that you're in.
Your place in the hierarchy.
Again, maybe that's an ego thing, right? Because the way you are in the hierarchy typically follows age as well. So there's also, I was 3 or 4 years older than people in my class. So the people that are above me on the hierarchy sometimes are my age, or I'm older. And I mean, I couldn't care less about that. But if you're going to bring the hierarchy and I have to work with that, it becomes frustrating. To a point, I remember at one hospital, this one doctor said, this is what I need you to do for me. And I said, no, you mean do with you, right? I'm not working here for you. And again, that was me being very snappy in an environment. I was like, no, well, it might work that way. But I think when you think about what you're saying, just say it slowly. That's not how this actually works. And who knows, maybe if I hadn't done all these other things and went and seen a different experience and had the experiences I had, I might have felt different, or the frustrations wouldn't have been as severe. But I've also had the experience, I think this is most important. I've had the experience of working with the most senior, accomplished, whatever people that you wouldn't be surprised if they had an ego and how they treated people. And you're just, no, if this person can do it, I can guarantee you can as well.
I have this interesting reaction as you're speaking. We've gone from that space of expansiveness in you and that animated energy of possibility to this kind of quite heavy, almost defeated, frustrated energy. And what keeps popping into mind is a story you told in the book about the first time well, I don't know if it was the first time, but you were in a surgical team that was removing a donor heart for a transplant patient. And the cardiothoracic surgeon gave you the opportunity to hold the heart in your hands. Tell us about that. What was that like, that feeling of holding a human heart that was still beating in your hands?
That was amazing. I think my supervisor asked me if I wanted to go with him. It was at 5 a.m. and I was like, why not? Let's go. Again, look, I'm not operating. I'm just there as the student and watching and assisting where they need me. When he said that, I was like, so I just put my hand over. The chest is open, the heart has been exposed, and I was just putting my hand on top of the pericardium. And he said, no, put your hand in the pericardial sac, basically hug the heart and just feel it. Because, you're all sterile. This is before they clamped their aorta and started doing all the process things. And I felt this thing just going. I hiked up Lion's Head that day. I went up on Lion's Head by myself. It was like one of those days that all of a sudden becomes cloudy in Cape Town and then a bit rainy. But I just went up there and I just sat there being like, yep, that's what I did today. I had no one to talk to, but I just had all this energy. And my goodness, look, medicine, man, what a freaking beautiful degree, career. When medicine really just shines and you see like, wow, this is what people are talking about. And I mean, I wasn't even the specialist doing that. This person's probably done this so many times. But in the same way, and people in Cape Town who live in Cape Town on the promenade when there's a nice sunset doesn't get old, that could never get old. A human heart. And there it is. Sad situation of the donor, but seeing the advances and the extent in which this profession that we are in can do and can contribute to. Getting frustrated in some of those little things, that makes it worth it because you see that we can achieve that. When we fix the little frustrations, we can come home and be late to the party. Oh, Flip, where have you been? Sorry, just put in a heart in someone. Or I just watched that happen. Good memories, freaking good memories. There was another story. It is the Grey's Anatomy story in the book where I was visiting the renal unit to speak with the team, ran a study trying to understand the factors that were influencing organ donation consent rates in the Western Cape. And we've been collecting this data, and I just went in to check and see if there were any referrals that had happened overnight. I built a relationship with the one nurse, and she started treating me like a very naughty but lovable grandchild. She's like, we're busy now. We can't entertain your nonsense. And I was like, no, I'm actually here for a serious question. At the time, we're looking at the logistics of getting the team because there was a donor referral from PE or Gqeberha, and the surgeons needed to fly from here with the transplant coordinators to PE because the recipient for the heart, the kidney, that would be in Cape Town. And I was like, is there space? Because typically they either, if they fly commercial sometimes, or they can fly private. And this was one of those where there was donated flights for this kind of exercise. Went to the airport and didn't go to the normal entrance. Went to the hangar entrance, got into this tiny but very snazzy plane. Again, donated flights, flew to Gqeberha, 45 minutes, walked out of there with the cooler boxes with organs in transit, taken to the hospital. I remember walking in with the team and I was like, this is an episode right here. This is the episode and we're walking in and it's happening. My goodness. Again, another wow feeling when you end up flying back to Cape Town. Heart transplant happened at the one hospital, liver transplant, and then the kidneys. It was all in a day's work. That one donor, 5 people, heart, 2 kidneys, The liver was split in two for two kids. It was epic. Get to the airport because the surgeon was saying, okay, we're clamping the aorta in Gqeberha. In Cape Town, they can start opening up the recipient because it's a 45-minute flight. It's a 30-minute drive from the hospital. So by the time we get here, it's quick exchanges. And I remember standing there and hearing the person on the phone saying, yeah, is the plane ready? And said, yep, we're just fueling up. And I was like, wait, but is there no check-in counter? We just walked straight past. We walked onto the tarmac at Gqeberha Airport, and I think I was carrying one of the cooler boxes, and I just felt like this is my main character moment. It's amazing.
What a story. This metaphor keeps coming into mind about, like, if we could reach in and feel your heart and transplant that passion into the medical field, like what might be possible. And you told me when we first chatted about the possibility of doing this conversation, there were two things you said that stood out for me. The one was that you don't quite know where you get this chutzpah from. You don't know where you get this confidence to just push back and challenge and ask the why questions. And the other thing you said to me was that you somehow always find your own way and your own path. And I'm wondering where the path might take you next.
We've established that we don't know if it'll take us to run for president. We know that.
Okay. I'm not sure you can have the kind of influence you want to influence as president, but let's see.
Hey, if I can sign on the dotted line and healthcare decisions around the world are affected, maybe. But maybe I'm in the wrong country to do that. I joke about that, but that does influence. I'm happy where I work right now at BCG. I'm learning a lot about the business side of doing things and how, being in medicine, you learn how to deal and work with people, particularly in like difficult situations, difficult personal situations. But I think what I'm learning at BCG is like, okay, you know how to work with people and speak with people and translate information to them. What I'm learning here is how to do that in a setting in which you're still managing different stakeholders and different ideas that might be in tension, but it's figuring out how to do it in a way that you still get ahead, you still move the needle forward. How to, when there's two stakeholders that are just not clashing and their clashing is the roadblock to the progress, how to deal with very high senior executive people from a point not so much of like how to speak to them, but to understand in the organizations and companies at which they are the executives or the executive teams, what is the thinking that goes into decision making there? What are the data points that they require for that particular company or institution to make a particular decision or to not make a particular decision? What evidence is required to get that decision made or not made? And in this environment, what level of evidence and how does it need to be presented? What I see myself doing 10 years' time, potentially, is being in an environment where I understand for the organization that I work in, this is what we need to make the decisions. This is the level of evidence I need to inform whether we propose this idea or we don't propose it, or we propose this solution or versus another. Because of COVID, and you saw how the private sector, very important in the thinking and working around the processing of vaccinations and investigating and studying and then processing, and how it wasn't just medically trained people that were doing that were instrumental in addressing that pandemic health emergency crisis, right? It was, you need to understand how to do project management. You need to understand what are supply chain. How can they be impacted by a global pandemic? Can certain things still function? And I'm learning all of that. I'm growing, I'm enjoying it. If we assume I will not be at BCG in 10 years' time, where am I? Probably at a health-specific global health organization. Global health is probably going to look different in 10 years' time. It'll still be the constants, but I think in terms of how geopolitics influences that, might be very different. There might be less reliance on governments.
Right.
But I know that I will definitely be running more marathons. I want to ski more and probably increase my certification for one of the languages I'm learning, whether it's Spanish or Italian.
I want to remind you that in the book's prologue, you said that your ultimate goal is eventually to become an academic or a clinician or both within a global community of thinkers and innovators?
That is on page 21, maybe.
Hmm.
Will I be an academic? Will I be a clinician? Right now, I don't think I'm doing neither of those things. But being in a community and working in a community of global thinkers, that seems to be the path at the moment. If anything, my job in many ways kind of reflects that. There's a lot of global going on, like what we do, clients we work for. So we'll see. Maybe in a couple of years, let's do part 2. Here's where we are.
Because I've read the book and I have more insight into some of the stories, I feel like there's so much we haven't talked about. There's so many things we haven't even touched on. Even just the story of where you are today. And earlier you referred to, you made a decision not to do your ComServe because you didn't think you were going to use it, but you did complete your ComServe. And I'm thinking that a young colleague who might be listening might think, oh, but you left, you didn't stick it out. Oh, but you did, you stayed, you completed your community service. What advice would you have for a young person who's currently in medical school, feeling some of that frustration and helplessness, overwhelmed by the burden of responsibility, challenged by the hierarchy? What would you say to somebody like that today?
It's something I didn't enjoy hearing and I didn't find particularly instructive in the moment when I heard it. But in hindsight, it was helpful to note that you're not the only one. Unfortunately, you're not the only one.
Yeah.
It would probably be a good thing if only one or if a handful of people were frustrated. I think I've also had the benefit and the immense privilege of having seen much early in my medical path the different parts that exist beyond being a clinician. And in part, the things I was interested in and wanted to do were more that way inclined. So I think that's not so much advice, but to contextualize that there are different parts to and different ways in which we can put to practice everything we learn in medicine, internship, and ComServe, even if you do medical officer years or you do registrar time. A lot that we learn and experience and do in medicine is so transferable. It's just a matter of we don't know how to package it in that way. Constantly managing stakeholders. You're constantly dealing with things that are in tension. You're constantly managing multiple situations you see that a job ad with someone who can adapt to high pressure environments. Hey, you've managed multiple wards overnight. No one died, you were okay. All of those things are skills, and sometimes you don't see it as completely related and useful. But I don't think anyone should do medical school ever again. But would I do the process and the journey again? 100%. Because part of it, I think I blossomed and really grew into myself and who I am today through that. But I think it's important to know that even when people leave clinical medicine and go do something else, there is still the stigma of, what a waste. But it's not, because who knows, maybe you wouldn't have done what you did if you hadn't done medicine, right? You wouldn't have had whatever experience that led you to that next thing. And sometimes if you leave for any other reason, that's also okay, because we're becoming more primed to that within medicine, that some people don't enjoy it. Some people find it difficult or find it just the angst and the frustrations and all the things that occur in medicine. They maybe are just like, no, actually, I can't function in this kind of environment, notwithstanding all the other personality frustrations that occur in other jobs. But it's just like, hey, this is not the job for me. Feeling bad and like a self-deprecating way of thinking that, I'm leaving, but now I had taken someone else's spot. No, you got that spot. You were in the spot. You chose to let it go. If someone else can't take that spot, I don't think that's very helpful for the individual to think like that, particularly when you're trying to justify whether or not this is the right thing to do. But again, to also look around, there are people that are still clinicians who left, this, did that, then came back. You don't have to do the path back to back, med school, internship, ComServe, reg time, then you're a consultant. It doesn't have to be that way. If you have other interests, hold space for that, because unfortunately, you don't want medicine or any job to be the nucleus of your life, because if the nucleus is crumbling, then everything is crumbling. And that's my biggest push of like, treat medicine as beautiful and rewarding and wholesome and all the things that it can be and often is. Treat it not as this calling or this virtuous thing that you're doing. Treat it as a job. And this is not to take away from what medicine does have and maybe other jobs don't have, but it allows you as the individual to be intentional to carve out time outside of medicine. Because that's also something that's not drilled into us as a, hey, I'm not gonna, as medicine, say to medical students or doctors and whatnot, no, guys, if you have free time, go have fun. No, if you're not using it, I will take it from you. Medicine will say, okay, come, give me your free time. Stay longer at the hospital. Do this, do that. Obviously, it needs to be said. I don't want to be misquoted that you don't just leave and abdicate your responsibilities to go do your personal things, but knowing that the time that you're meant to be there is done, the handovers were done, go rest, go for the run, go for the hike, choose to work in the hospital or the province that's close to the things you care about, because maybe the hospital you've chosen is the right one for the training, but it might not be for the rest of your life. Do you need to move? Some of these decisions are taken away from us, at least from a ComServe and internship role, where the choices are not as open. But I think that investment in the things we care about beyond are important, because otherwise medicine can unfortunately just take.
You told me the other day that you felt like walking away from clinical medicine was a really difficult breakup.
100%. I think I went through all the stages of grief multiple times, because for the most part, like, I mean, you quoted from the book, my goal and my thinking was, this is going to be my lifetime. I'm going to be a practicing doctor, and no different to thinking that this is your partner for life. And the breakup came where you just realize that, look, the things that I want and care about don't exist here. Like, I still care about you, but the other things in my life that are just as important, if not more than this, they're not, the priority status doesn't exist for them here. And walking away was hard.
I can imagine. And in my own way, I remember somebody asking me if I would contribute to a book they were writing about doctors who walk away from medicine. And I sat and I thought about it long and hard. And I was like, well, I haven't walked away from medicine. I've walked away from a particular kind of medicine. I've redefined my relationship to medicine. Medicine is still where it's at. It's still what I'm about, but I have a different vision for what that means and what that looks like. And I've given myself permission to follow that. And people might have their judgments and assumptions and perceptions, and there's a lot of the social pressure to feel guilty about the needs of the population. And all of those things are relevant. But I think if we don't, those of us who feel a calling to a different path, if you think of it as a breakup from medicine and that you can never go back, I think what you're doing, you're still in medicine, but it's a different path, and that maybe it's a new path that we don't fully understand yet. Just to keep it really simplistic, when I started coaching, I started my coaching course. Coaching was a very new field. People didn't even know it existed in the health context back then. And I remember sending an email to a head of department at Tygerberg who had done some research on motivational interviewing, because it was one of the tools they were building into coaching practice. And I said, I'm busy with a diploma in coaching and I want to come talk to you. And he was like, coaching, what's that? If somebody had said to me that health coaching or wellness coaching would be a thing one day, it didn't even exist in the paradigm. There was no such concept in the paradigm. It was just beginning to emerge in the business world. And so I'm wondering about things we don't even have names for yet that will be roles in the field in the future. And that you've got to be brave sometimes and step away to follow a new path and trust. As you said, you were in that place. You did not deprive someone else of that place. You hold the place, your seat in that circle in a unique way.
And I fully am growing to love the analogy to a relationship where staying because you've put so much time into it doesn't justify staying longer and being more miserable forward, but also leaving at that point and deciding to call it quits and walk away. Neither does it take away from the time, because you've grown and learned, and that's what I try. And when I've had these conversations, I'm like, no, I'm not discouraging anyone to do medicine. We didn't get married. That's all. It was a long and beautiful and healthy relationship, but I don't think I would say I fully outgrew the relationship.
Mm.
I'm sure there's a love book or some story. We wanted different things.
Tell us about your name. I'm going to try and pronounce it, and I'm going to apologize in advance if I get it wrong. I did practice, but for some reason I'm struggling to wrap my tongue around it. Slogonolofatso.
It's like 90% there, but Hlohonolo.
Slogonolofatso.
The easiest thing about it is if you just read the words in the way they are, it's a mouthful and it's what, 14 letters. That's your first name. I have a collective more than 26 alphabet letters, but Hlohonolo is my given Sotho name. My dad is Sotho, my mom is Xhosa. One of my dad's sisters gave me the name, and it means to be blessed in Sotho. The providence that's in Black African children's names, you sometimes see it. I think I've been blessed with, the experiences I've had, the life that I have, experience I still have. And I'm not a religious person, but there's times when I'm just like, yo, things are going really well. And I'm just like, yeah, no, I'm blessed. When they're not going well, it's not that I'm not blessed, but I'm like, look, still blessed, but okay, maybe this is the rough patch. Let's roll with it. But I think I've seen and appreciated and continue to see and appreciate the meaning of my name. I often ask people what their names mean, particularly if it's a name I'm not used to hearing, because I have this understanding. That's the story. Hloni is the shortened version. My grandmother, my dad's mother, called me that. If you meet someone whose name is Hloni, you can ask them, is your full name Hlohonolofatso or Lihlohonolo? That is not unlikely. But yeah, I use Hloni for everything unless it specifies the name as it is in your passport. When someone asked me, do you have a shorter version? I said, my friend, trust me, this is the shorter version.
Yes. Well, I also have a thing about names and their meanings, and my daughter's name is Angeliki, and you know Angeliki, and it's so frustrated. People call her Angles, they call her Kicks, they call her Kiki, they call her Angela, they call her Angie. When she was little, she used to insist that they call her by her full name. Now she just goes with it because it's just easier. But I think being able to say someone's full name is important.
It's the literal version of I see you.
Exactly. Amy, you've been very quiet for the 2 hours. Is there anything that you would like to ask or say?
Sure. Lot to talk about, lot to digest, process. I think if I were to summarize this conversation, it would be that words matter in the words that you choose, in the stories that you tell, the fact that you're a writer, that story that you told of you going up Lion's Head, having this life-changing experience of holding a human heart, and there was nobody to tell. And as a storyteller, that is the most painful thing, is you've experienced this thing and you just want to tell somebody your story. But as a writer, that's what you often end up doing. You write the book so that somebody somewhere can read that story, so that you have your audience, you have your reader understand that. I love that idea of you having the vision of you putting the stethoscope around your neck and the white coat on. I just think that's such a lovely childlike image. If you believe in destiny or fate, I think when you're a child, you have that moment of life. One day when I grow up, and then you have that vision of your life. For me, I remember I was 5 or 6, and I used to play teacher all the time with my sister. All I wanted to do was go to school, and my sister was older than me, and she would get homework, and I would always be jealous because I just wanted to do homework. That image of the stethoscope and the white coat, it makes so much sense to me. But I did have a question. I made my own theory up about, as a storyteller, you needed somebody to tell the stories to. But why a book? Why did you decide to write the book? That's what I'd love to know.
I hope it's an interesting story. Interesting, but also surprising story. I never planned to write a book. I went to the Franschhoek Literary Festival May of the year I left to the US, and a friend had written a book and he was on one of the panels, and we just went for the weekend. Oh, this is fun. One of the publishers came to say hi to him while we were having wine at the author's lounge. And once I've had a couple glasses of wine, you saw the energy. I just throw things out there just to see, does that land? Is that your sense of humor? And I made a joke to the publisher. They were the publishers of Jacques Pauw's book, My President's Keeper. And I said, great book, but I haven't seen you folks publish anything by a doctor. And she asked me 2 questions. One, are you a doctor? I said, yes. Have you written something we can publish? I said, not yet, just tongue in cheek. And she's like, well, here's my card. Let's chat if you're writing something. And again, that chutzpah and it's like, whatever. Let's have the conversation. Who knows where it leads to? I live in Frederick. We're at, I think it's closed down now, the cafe, very close to Garden Center. Went there for a cup of coffee. I pitched this idea of some of the journaling I had. I was like, yeah, I could put that into a book. It could be for 3 different audiences. And she's like, yeah, sounds interesting. I'll pitch it. Let's see. Voila. So that was cheeky plus being in the right place plus I guess just knowing how to talk to people and whether it was a joke or whatever it was, but that's how the book ended up. It was a genesis of the book, and then when I started writing, I think what carried me through was, oh, okay, this is what I'm doing, which is I'm trying to tell a story of this was my experience. My parents aren't medical doctors, PhDs and that, but they're not medical doctors. And this was my experience of this. And I think I saw a lot of people who were experiencing this either because, oh, they've done this before, family member, brother or sister. So they were not new to the process. So it was to understand your loved one, your child, son, girlfriend, boyfriend, whatever is doing medicine. This would be interesting to find out. Most books were also written by doctors are looking back on a career of medicine and it's telling a full arc. I'm doing this now. I've just finished. I'm in the next phase, but let me talk you through. So that was what became the impetus and the driving force to finish the book, which was very different to how we ended up starting to write it.
My closing point would just be, please keep asking why. You're definitely a storyteller, whatever form that is, whether you make a film, whether you write a book, whether you make theater, whether you write a song, you're a storyteller. So please keep asking why. Like I said, words matter. The words that you choose, you're so calculated in everything that you say, but in the best possible way, not in a clinical way. And you choose them so beautifully. So please keep asking why. I really believe there's a reason why you have the brain that you have. There's a reason why you see the world the way that you do. And the questioning is really important and really beautiful. And you have a gift to be able to take that perspective and turn it into something else. That alchemy of turning the wound into wisdom. So thank you. I'm looking forward to seeing what stories you tell next.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Amy. Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I only echo what Amy has just said, but I want to ask you one last question, Hloni. You said to me when we met that you wonder what book you might have written if you had written it after ComServe rather than before. And I'm wondering if you were to pitch a book idea to a publisher today, what book would you want to write?
So the title of the first book was Becoming a Doctor. And the word consultant in medicine is you're the specialist. But I've thought about the idea of saying becoming a doctor and then becoming a consultant, which is a double entendre depending on if you're someone who knows medicine and the consulting world, you're like, okay, that's catchy. And I mean, I guess it would catch the bit of why the career pivot and probably, again, unraveling this consulting environment that a lot of people, when they hear you're a consultant, oh gosh, what do you do? And then no one can actually explain what they do as a consultant. And it would probably be, in some ways, tongue-in-cheek, but also probably telling the stories through the types of people and the experiences I've had. I think that's what it would be. Who knows? Maybe one day.
Well, sounds like a great book. I would read it.
Thank you. I had to dig up my copy.
What's it like to hold your own book that you wrote, put your heart and soul and told your story?
With my stethoscope in tow.
Yes. Yes.
Oh,
Yes. We'll share a link to your book in the podcast description. What's it like to hold your book?
Every time I see it, I'm like, oh, that's nice. Also, I have a mask. I'm like, why was I wearing a mask? And it was COVID.
It was COVID, exactly.
During the times. It felt great when I got first advanced copies. I think I got 20 advanced copies and I got 6 of them and they were delivered to the house and I was at home. I think I was post-call that day and I was at home and they were delivered here and I was just like, whoa. Because I'd seen it in PDF form, but then holding it and other than spending time doing groceries at Woolies, the other place I spend a lot of time that is a store is exclusive books. Sometimes I'll just walk around there and just like look at different books. I'm like, oh, this is nice, this is nice. And then I was like, oh my goodness, I can see the book in the store. So there were times that I figured out where the different exclusive books are.
Mm.
When I was in Joburg, when I was in Cape Town, when I was in East London, I was like, oh, they closed the exclusive books here. So where do people buy books? And then we found out, oh, there's other kinds of bookstores.
Did you
It's
walk
fun.
around exclusive books looking for your book?
Yeah. Sometimes I'd go in there and say, hey, do you have a copy of the book called Becoming the Doctor?
Uh-huh.
I'm also wearing a mask, so they can't really see my full face. And I go and find the book. I take a picture of like where it is, what setting, and then I say, can I just sign 10 of these? And then this one lady looked at me at Cavendish, said, why? I was like, oh my God, you're the author. I was like, yeah. Which was interesting, an interesting experience, but it was
Amazing.
fun.
Hloni, you're inspiring me. I've always said I would write a book, and my working title has always been Who is the Doctor? And there's many plays on that. But Amy, maybe I'll get my act together at some point. Who knows? But certainly I'm feeling inspired.
Good. Who is the doctor?
Hmm.
Yeah, who is the doctor? Who is the doctor?
Exactly.
Please do it. Please do it.
What are you left with at the end of this time of sharing some of your life experiences with us?
Like I said, work has just been really busy, and I came out of a meeting and had like an hour to just gather my thoughts again. And it feels good. Feels good to chat. Feels great. I enjoyed this conversation. I think there's a lot of, to Amy's point of like choosing words, is I think I'm cautious and thoughtful about it because I've gone through this process of writing a book, but at the same time just observing and paying attention to what matters. And it's not so much that I like, don't want someone to be offended or whatnot about something I've said. The justification that often people give of, oh, it was taken out of context. And I'm like, okay, often that statement is not about something that was taken out of context. And I think another thing is that when I left Meta, it wasn't a breakup where I left and threw the toys and a bad mouth and brought down my experience. There's also a part of it that some people don't know of, oh, why did you leave? And I think if the initial book was written post-Comso, it would have thrown lots of punches, more than it did. Medicine's taking a bit of a beating at the moment, somewhat necessarily for just system related things. But it feels good to have these discussions, because it also reminds me that it was a good decision for me to leave. Like, I don't have this conversation feeling like, oh man, I shouldn't have done what I did. No. If anything, I'm like, A, I'm healthy and a good place. B, I can look back and like, yeah, I did leave. And C, I don't feel any residual unworked through emotions about it. I'm going to go for a lovely run now and have a good evening. How do you feel?
I feel inspired and I feel touched. The image that's staying with me is the picture of your hand reaching into someone's chest to touch their heart. And I feel like your words do that. And I feel like you will do that with your life. And I'm not sure what that means or what it will look like. But I agree with Amy. Don't stop asking why. And you've said elsewhere that we can't afford to give up on hope. Not quite in those words, but it was around ethical leadership and the importance of staying hopeful.
Don't get tired.
Don't get tired.
In the absence of ethical leadership, don't get tired.
And so I'm hoping you will take care of yourself so that you don't get tired, so that you hold on to hope, and so that you can be a part of the solution for the future.
For as long as I can run and see the ocean, see the mountain, I think we can work with that. It's good to be reminded of that. And I try to remind myself also, because it's easy to get into the negative spiral. And then
the risk of opening up a whole other topic, you wrote a chapter in your book that said to complain is to be privileged. And so we don't have a right to complain.
yeah. Maybe now, 5 years later, there's probably a lot of self-righteousness in saying that. You don't get to complain, but a generous take, and probably how it would put that now is that, yes, let's complain, but if that's all you do, that's where the privilege is, because if you just complain.
So do you still have hope?
For what?
Medicine. Life.
Do I still have hope for medicine? Yes, but there are moments where I've taken some quiet validation. When I saw there was an article published, a letter to the editor to the South African Medical Journal, certain hospital leaders who were saying that they should do away with ComServe as a requirement because the state can't actually afford it. And I wrote an article at Daily Maverick 3 years ago, saying in many ways something like that. And I think it was doctors are in limbo while they wait for something. And I went and saw that article and I was like, I wasn't crazy, but maybe I was just too early. But again, it's a Pyrrhic victory that I was taking for myself. When I saw that article and then I went and read my article, I was like, see, I wasn't just being a frustrated, crazy kid who was fighting with you guys.
Yeah.
But I told you so's don't often get us anywhere. I do have hope for sure, but I think if I could inject anything into that space, it's like, hey, it's okay if this thing that you're so passionate and want to hold on to for dear life is not something that's going to work. We need to do away with it. Yeah, finished. Because there's certain things that exist because of just remnants of promises made and ideas during the transition and blah, 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 free healthcare, this and that, the NHI in and of itself being that sort of idea. You can't even handle the situation now. How are you going to handle it when you're trying to do something even bigger than this? And the initial reaction to that is like, oh, you just want to keep private health. No, you're not the people that need to be the ones who are the custodians of creating universal healthcare for all when you haven't been able to manage the public health system as it is. If anything, yes, you inherited some of these problems, but you haven't made it better. So how about we first figure out how to fix this? Then, so you want to buy a freaking a Dyson hairdryer when your electric plugs don't work. My friend, come, fix your plugs first, and then you go buy the very expensive hairdryer. But now you want to get the most expensive hairdryer because this is what we've promised. But how is it going to work? How is it going to be sustained? Because you can't even sustain the existing hairdryer you have. And then they just end up in political talk, and then people fight, and then we end up having a race discussion, and then we call each other names, and then we write the articles, we call each other names in the comment section, and then we move to London and Australia and America. And then we all come back because the healthcare is cheaper here and better here.
I hear some of the despair in everything you've just said. I feel like I want to remind you of the advice you said you would give a medical student who was feeling frustrated and a little bit lost in the system. And the first thing you said was, you are not alone. So you are not alone in the vision that you hold. And I think one of the dilemmas of being, I'm going to use the word visionary, but of having a bigger vision is that sometimes it can feel like a lonely place, especially when you are walking on the edge of a paradigm. You haven't yet been able to clear the path and see what's next. And perhaps if we can get you to a place where you really start feeling at home and you know who your community is, who the global think tank is that's going to help you with these issues, that space you were in the US of possibility. And rather than going, well, we can't do this, begin asking, how might we be able to do this?
Exactly. And it's not just a money thing. There's so many other things required. 100%. I appreciate that. I will definitely take that.
Thank you for making the time. Thank you for sharing your story. I look forward to watching and witnessing what unfolds in your future. Every now and again, I want you to put your hand on your heart and remember that it's still beating and that it's got a lot of passion. I'm Dr. Maria Christodoulou, and you've been listening to the Awakening Doctor podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it with your friends, follow Awakening Doctor on Instagram, Facebook, and Spotify, and go to Apple Podcasts to subscribe, rate, and give us a good review. Thank you so much for listening.